Parliament, after the summer recess, has been debating whether or not to make changes to the election code of Ukraine. As any observer of Ukrainian elections will note, rather than have an ongoing election code, typically changes get made right before the election. And so that would tend to benefit certain parties, in that short run-up before elections. So there's been pressure from the international community, pressure from civil society within Ukraine to try to tackle the election law issue so that everybody knows the rules from the beginning. There's more or less a level playing field, so to speak, and to make some general improvements to stop election fraud and these sorts of things. That push started around about a year ago and is continued. Last spring, the one draft of the election law, 3112, passed with the bare minimum of 226 votes, and it was a mixed match coalition of who voted for it. And as you know, you have to have 226 votes as a minimum on 2 readings for a bill to get sent to the president to become law, assuming the president signs it. So right now the debate is, what's the new election law going to look like, and what are the potential changes? The current election law to Parliament elects half the members from party list, and the other half from districts geographically based around the country. Because of the Russian occupation of Crimea and half of the Donbas, currently there are a number of districts which are not 27 districts altogether out of 27 out of 225 districts which are occupied, where it's not possible to hold elections right now. So instead of having 450 members of parliament, you're looking at potentially 423 as a technical note. So the changes being discussed primarily revolve around, should they abolish the geographically based districts in favor of party list elections only. Now, in 2006, Ukraine had a closed list, party list ballot for the entire parliamentary election. So there were no districts, everyone was elected from party list. The problem was, with closed list systems, the party bosses decide the places for everyone on the ballot, and then the voter is limited to simply choosing a party with no input as to who they like within the party, and that's all decided by the party bosses. So the closed list system actually turned out to be just as flawed, if not worse, than the 50-50 system which Ukraine has been using in most elections since 1998. Now, Ukraine in 98, 2002, 2012, 2014 used this 50-50 system. 2006, 2007, they used the closed list party ballot system. So the debate is now perhaps look at an open list for the elections to take place. So 100% by party list, but an open list. Now, what's the difference between an open list and a closed list? Again, with a closed list, the party bosses decide everything. The voter has no input other than just to choose the party. Under an open list system, there are variations on this, but this would essentially be like having a primary and a general election on the same day. So, for example, if I liked, say, the Green Party, but I didn't like the leader of the Green Party, I liked a young up-and-comer, I could vote for the Green Party, and then at the same time I could also vote for the young up-and-comer as one of the people that should have a higher ranking on the party list. So first they calculate the number of votes for the party and whether or not they pass the barrier. And then the second thing they do is within that party, they look at all the votes for the different candidates within that party, and then the top candidates within each party are the ones that go onto parliament. So it's a little more complicated, and the votes have to be a little more strategic, but it is an interesting system. This system has worked really well in the Baltics and some other countries. The model that Ukraine's looking at of open list systems has one advantage that a lot of open list systems don't have, is that it's based on geography. So there's a geographical aspect to it, which ensures that there's some representation from the smaller regions. If you look at things geographically, and this is one of the problems in 2006, is typically most of the people elected to parliament were from Kyiv. So for Chernivtsi, for Kherson, for the smaller oblast, there's very little representation under a closed list system. So this is one of the good things about the draft law 3112. Now, obviously, though, with half the members of parliament currently from elected districts, they're not going to be in favor of switching to a party list, because that means they got to join a party. That means they have to start from scratch in many ways, and they got to give up their district and run separately. So that's there's certainly doubts as to whether or not there's going to be votes to change the current law, because it's by definition against the interest of half the members of parliament. That being said, there may be enough pressure from civil society and the international community to change it. But we will see what happens in October. Speaker Parubiy has promised to vote on that bill in October. Another important aspect of that law, which has wide support, I saw a poll the other day where around, I think about 80% of Ukrainians support giving IDPs, internally displaced persons, particularly from the Donbas and Crimea, giving them the right to vote regardless of where they have their propyska. As you know, there's this old Soviet mechanism to control the population, so you had to have a propyska where you're registered. And unlike North America, where you live here, you got an apartment here, and you work over here, and it doesn't really matter, here it actually matters, because up until recently, for example, it affected where you could go to see the doctor. Now, fortunately, under the new reform, healthcare reform, that's not an issue. You can see any doctor you want. But this propyska has also limited where people could vote. So if you're registered in the occupied part of Donbas, then theoretically you would have to go back there to vote. But since there aren't elections there, you're deprived of your vote. Now, Ukraine, as you know, has almost 2 million IDPs, 2 million internally displaced persons because of the war. And that's a lot of people who are now living in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro. I believe the number in Kharkiv alone is about 200,000 people. So those people need a right to vote somewhere. They can't go back home to vote for the most part. So the draft law that's being considered would address giving them the right to vote where they live now. And I think that has, like I mentioned, there's widespread public support for that. So that looks like that's going to become law in some shape, form, or fashion. The other key element that's being debated on the new election law is the current barrier for party list. In other words, what percent of the vote does a party have to get to receive seats in parliament is 5%. So there's several proposals out there. The consensus seems to be moving towards 3%. So that would mean any party that gets 3% will get seats in parliament. It remains to be seen if that would be under an open list system entirely. And also one thing that's not being widely discussed, but it would be maybe a compromise solution, would be to keep the 50-50 system in terms of you have half the members elected from districts and half from a party list, but make the party list an open list, right? So rather than having a closed list like you have now, make it open, give the voter more input into who the party's top candidates are, but keep the district representation. So that could also be a good compromise, which could persuade those members of parliament currently from districts to support the new election law. The good thing is, under the proposed election law, the propyska would de facto be irrelevant. That's very positive. Another important area, as I just mentioned, is healthcare. Under the new healthcare reform, you can choose any family doctor anywhere you want. If you live in Volyn, but you work in Dnipro, you can choose a doctor in Dnipro, whereas before you would have to go back to Volyn and take a doctor there. So now you can, so in healthcare and possibly elections, we'll see this October, the propyska is essentially being made obsolete. And that's a positive for Ukrainians, because it just gives them more choices and empowers them, and it's a modern mechanism. Propyska was originally put in place to keep better control on the population.